The river of time flows deep and wide, carrying the stories of empires and emperors, of rise and ruin, drifting slowly through the mist of centuries. If you listen closely to the currents of history, you can hear the faint echoes of the Tang dynasty, a golden age where poetry flourished like wildflowers and the scent of incense hung heavy in the air of Chang'an. It was a time of immense grandeur where the boundaries of the world seemed to expand with every passing year. And in the heart of this glorious epoch, a singular figure emerged from the shadows to cast a silhouette that would eclipse the sun itself. This is the story of a girl born not to the purple silk of royalty, but to the scent of cedar and pine, a merchant's daughter who would climb the perilous steps to the dragon throne. Let your mind drift back to the early 7th century, to a China unifying under the iron will of the Li family. The air is filled with the dust of new construction and the optimism of a dynasty in its infancy. In the bustling, vibrant world of the Tang aristocracy, there was a man named Wu Zetian. He was a man of the earth and the forest, a wealthy timber merchant who had made a gamble that changed the fate of his lineage. When the Li family raised their banners to overthrow the crumbling Sui dynasty, Wu Zetian did not hide his wealth. He opened his coffers and provided the timber, the coin, and the support the rebels needed. It was a merchant's bet, high risk and infinite reward, and when the Li family succeeded, founding the Tang dynasty, the timber merchant was elevated to the high nobility, becoming a duke and a chancellor. It is here, in this household of new money and old wisdom, that the girl was born. It was the year 624. They named her Wu Zhao, though the world would come to know her by many names before the end. In a time when the birth of a daughter was often met with a polite sigh, a quiet resignation, that she would one day be married off to secure an alliance, this house was different. Wu Zetian saw something in the bright, dark eyes of his second daughter. He saw a spark of intelligence that mirrored his own sharp mind for strategy. Instead of handing her only the embroidery needle and the silk loom, instruments of domestic silence, he placed in her small hands the heavy scrolls of history. Imagine the quiet afternoons in the Wu manor. The sunlight slants through the wooden lattice windows, illuminating dancing motes of dust. While other noble daughters were learning the delicate art of pleasing a future husband, young Wu was learning the art of ruling a state. She read the classics. She studied the rise and fall of dynasties, the strategies of generals, and the philosophy of Confucius, though she would later twist those teachings to her own ends. Her father encouraged her to write, to think, and to speak. She absorbed the political landscape of the Tang court, not from the perspective of a servant, but from the perspective of a player. She learned that power was not just given by blood, it was seized by the mind. But the wheel of fate turns without pause, and the idyllic days of study could not last forever. When she was just 14 years old, the rumors of her beauty and her intellect reached the ears of the imperial palace. The Emperor Taizong, the warrior poet who had solidified the dynasty, sought to fill his harem with women of noble birth and distinctive character. The summons arrived at the Wu household like a thunderclap in a clear sky, a mandate from heaven. She was to enter the Forbidden City as a tyrant, a 5th-rank concubine, a position of honor, yet one of servitude. The day of her departure was steeped in the heavy emotion of farewells. Her mother, Lady Yang, wept openly, terrified for a young girl entering the labyrinthine depths of the imperial court, a place known as much for its treachery as for its beauty. History records that the young girl did not weep. She turned to her mother with a gaze that was unnervingly steady for a child of 14 and said, "How do you know it is not my fortune to meet the Son of Heaven? Why cry like a child?" There was no trembling in her voice, only the calm resolve of someone who knew that her destiny lay beyond the wooden gates of her father's house. The journey to Chang'an was a passage into another world. The capital was a sprawling metropolis, the center of the civilized world, where merchants from the Silk Road traded spices and gems, and monks chanted sutras in cloudy incense. But for the new concubine, the world shrank to the high, vermilion walls of the palace. Once the gates closed behind her, the noise of the city vanished, replaced by the hushed whispers of eunuchs and the rustle of silk robes. She was given the name Mei Niang, meaning the glamorous or beautiful girl, by Emperor Taizong. Yet, beauty in the Tang harem was a common currency. There were hundreds of women, like flowers in a vast garden, each vying for a single ray of sunlight from the emperor. To be beautiful was merely to be present. To survive, one had to be useful. Wu Meinyang understood this instinctively. She did not rely on the fleeting allure of her youth. Instead, she relied on the lessons of the timber merchant. Taizong was a man of intellect as well as war. He spent hours in the imperial study, surrounded by mounds of reports, edicts, and historical texts. He needed more than a silent beauty. He needed a mind that could keep pace with his own. It was here that the fifth-rank concubine found her footing. She became a secretary in the imperial study, a role that placed her at the very nerve center of the empire. Picture the scene within the quiet sanctity of the library. The smell of ink is sharp and metallic. The emperor sits at a low table, his brow furrowed over a map of the frontier. Wu Meiniang stands nearby, grinding the inkstick against the stone. A rhythmic, hypnotic sound that marks the passing of time. She is silent, observant. She reads the documents over his shoulder, absorbing the complex web of alliances, the flow of taxes, the disposition of armies. She watches how he balances the ambitious generals against the scholarly bureaucrats. She is seeing the machinery of the state naked and exposed. This was her true education, far surpassing the scrolls of her childhood. She was studying the emperor himself. There is a story from this time, a legend that has survived the erosion of centuries because it captures the very essence of the soul growing within that young woman. It is said that the emperor possessed a magnificent horse, a wild steed known as Lion Stallion. This horse was a creature of immense power and rage, untamable, throwing every master who dared to mount it. Taizong, frustrated and impressed by the beast's spirit, asked his gathered courtiers and ladies if anyone possessed the skill to break such an animal. The generals were silent. The ministers looked away. But the young concubine, Mei Niang, stepped forward from the shadows of the colonnade. Her voice was soft, melodious, yet it carried a chill that cut through the warm afternoon air. "I can control him, your majesty," she said, bowing low. "But I will need 3 things, an iron whip, an iron mace, and a dagger." The emperor, intrigued by the brutality of the request from such a delicate figure, asked her to explain. She raised her head, her eyes locking with the dragon's gaze. "First, I will lash him with the iron whip. If he does not submit, I will batter his head with the iron mace. And if he still will not submit, I will use the dagger to cut his throat." A silence descended upon the courtyard, heavier than the summer heat. It was a moment of absolute crystalline clarity. In her answer, she had laid bare her philosophy of power. It was not about patience, nor negotiation, nor gentle coaxing. It was about absolute dominance, submission or destruction. There was no middle ground. Emperor Taizong looked at the woman he had named the Glamorous. He saw the beauty of her face, the square forehead and full cheeks that marked her strength. But for the first time, he saw the steel spine beneath the silk robes. He was impressed by her courage, for few dared to speak of killing the emperor's prize horse. But he was also deeply unsettled. He recognized a ruthlessness that mirrored his own, a quality necessary for a king, but terrifying in a concubine. He did not punish her, but a distance grew between them. He kept her close as a secretary, valuing her mind, but he never promoted her. She remained a 5th-rank concubine for 12 long years. To Taizong, she was a useful tool, perhaps a curiosity, but he sensed the danger in her. He was the old lion, wise and scarred, and he recognized a young predator when he saw one. He knew that a will that's strong could not be contained forever. As the years drifted by, the vibrant energy of the palace began to shift. The great warrior emperor was growing old. The shadows in the hallways seemed to lengthen, and the smell of medicinal herbs began to replace the scent of flowers in the imperial chambers. The court began to look toward the future, toward the heir, the crown prince Li Zhe, Wu Meiniang, still young, still ambitious, and now armed with a profound understanding of how to wield the iron whip and the dagger of statecraft, watched the transition with calculating eyes. She knew that when an emperor died, his childless concubines were sent away to Buddhist convents to shave their heads and spend the rest of their lives praying for his soul in eternal isolation. It was a living death, a tomb for the living. But the merchant's daughter had no intention of fading into the smoke of incense and the drone of prayers. She had tasted the air of the inner court, and she had mastered the wild horse in her mind. As Taizong's health waned, she began to weave a new web, casting her gaze not on the dying sun, but on the rising moon. She looked toward the gentle, soft-hearted Prince Liji, and in him she saw her path to survival. The iron mace would not be needed here. For the young prince, she would use a different kind of power, one wrapped in whispers and longing. The old emperor's time was ending, but hers was just beginning. The heavy wooden gates of the Ganei temple closed with a finality that echoed like the ceiling of a tomb. The air inside was thick with the scent of sandalwood and old parchment, a fragrance that was meant to purify the soul but tasted only of ashes. To the woman who now knelt on the cold stone floor, her long silken hair, once adorned with the golden hairpins of the imperial court, fell to the ground in soft, dark ribbons, severed by the razor of a silent nun. With each lock that drifted to the floor, a piece of her former identity was stripped away. She was no longer the talented concubine, the glamorous Mei Niang who had mixed ink for the emperor. She was now simply a shadow in a sea of grey robes, condemned to spend her remaining years chanting sutras for the departed soul of Emperor Taizong. For most women, this was the end of the story. Slow fade into obscurity, marked only by the rhythm of the wooden fish drum and the changing of the seasons. But within the shaved head of the new nun burned a mind that refused to be extinguished. She recited the prayers with perfect cadence, her voice blending seamlessly with the others. Yet her thoughts were miles away, back within the vermilion walls of the forbidden city. She knew that the new emperor, Li Jie, now ruling as Gaozong, possessed a heart that was tender, perhaps too tender for the wolves that circled the throne. She remembered the stolen glances they had shared while his father lay dying, the unspoken promises that hung in the air like suspended dust motes. She knew that he would come, and he did. On the anniversary of his father's death, the young emperor entered the temple to offer incense. Amidst the rows of bowed heads and flickering candlelight, his eyes found hers. It was a moment suspended in time, a violation of sacred protocol that carried the weight of destiny. Tears were shed, tears of mourning, ostensibly, but beneath them lay a current of profound longing. This encounter did not go unnoticed. Empress Wang, the new emperor's primary wife, was locked in a bitter struggle for affection with a favored consort named Shaho. Seeing the emperor's gaze linger on the beautiful nun, the empress hatched a plan that would ultimately seal her own doom. She arranged for Wu to be brought back to the palace, intending to use her as a pawn to distract the emperor from consort Shaho. The merchant's daughter returned to the palace not as a conqueror, but as a humble servant, her hair growing back, her demeanor modest. She understood the precarious nature of her position. She was an anomaly, a woman who had belonged to the father and now belonged to the son, a transgression of deep social taboos. Yet she moved with the grace of a dancer navigating a field of blades. She served the empress dutifully, winning her trust, all the while weaving herself into the fabric of Gaozong's life. She became indispensable, her intellect shining as brightly as her beauty. When the emperor struggled with the burdens of state, it was Wu who offered clarity, drawing upon the lessons she had learned in Taizong's study. That the inner court was a place where power was a zero-sum game. As Wu's influence grew, giving birth to sons who solidified her status, the alliance with Empress Wang shattered. The empress and consort Shaho, once rivals, found a common enemy in this rising star. They conspired against her, whispering rumors of sorcery and impropriety. The atmosphere in the palace grew toxic, heavy with the static of unseen threats. It was in this suffocating climate, in the sweltering summer of 654, that the tragedy occurred which would irrevocably alter the course of history. Wu had given birth to a daughter, a quiet infant who became the center of a sudden, horrific storm. Empress Wang visited the nursery to see the child. Shortly after she left, Wu entered the room to find the cradle eerily silent. The infant was dead. The palace erupted in chaos. The emperor, grief-stricken and furious, demanded answers. Wu, weeping over the body of her child, pointed the finger at the last person to be seen with the baby, the empress. Whether it was a cold-blooded calculation by a mother willing to sacrifice everything for power, or a tragic crib death seized upon by a political genius, remains a secret buried in the dust of the Tang dynasty. But the result was absolute. The emperor's heart hardened against Wang. The retribution was swift and terrifying. The iron whip, once a metaphor for taming wild horses, became a reality of statecraft. Empress Wang and consort Xiao were stripped of their titles, imprisoned, and ultimately executed in a manner that sent a shiver through the empire. Their families were exiled, their names erased. In 655, in a grand ceremony that defied centuries of tradition, Wu Zetian was invested as empress. She sat beside Gaozong, not merely as a wife, but as a partner, her phoenix crown glittering with a light that seemed to rival the sun. However, her ascension was not greeted with applause by the old aristocracy. The elder statesmen, the guardians of tradition who viewed her pedigree as merchant class and her history as scandalous, simmered with resentment. They saw her as a usurper, a hen crowing at dawn. But Wu understood that to rule, one needed more than a title. One needed eyes and ears in every shadow. She began to construct an apparatus of control that was as efficient as it was ruthless. As Emperor Gaozong's health began to fail, plagued by debilitating headaches and episodes of blindness, the balance of power shifted physically within the throne room. A screen of sheer silk was lowered behind the emperor's throne. Behind this screen sat Empress Wu. From the shadows, her voice emerged, calm, authoritative, and decisive. She read the memorials, she drafted the edicts, and she adjudicated the disputes. The officials below would bow to the ailing emperor, but they knew that the mind directing the empire sat invisible behind the veil. They became known as the Two Sages, a duality of power where the female force was the chaotic creative engine driving the state. To secure this position against the entrenched aristocracy, she unleashed a reign of terror disguised as administrative justice. She empowered a new breed of officials, men like the infamous Lai Yunshan, who rose from obscurity to lead her secret police. They designed a copper box divided into compartments which was placed in the public square. Anyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest noble, could drop a petition or an accusation into the box, knowing it would reach the empress directly. It was a masterstroke of surveillance. The informer's box turned the entire population into potential spies. Trust evaporated among the old guard. A whisper in a tea-house could lead to a midnight arrest. The prisons filled with those who dared to question the legitimacy of the woman behind the screen. Interrogations were brutal, designed not just to extract confessions, but to break the spirit of the opposition. The aristocracy, which had stood like ancient oaks for centuries, was systematically pruned, their roots severed by the iron tools of Wu's new order. Yet, while the elites trembled, the common people saw a different face of the empress. She was a meritocrat who despised the arrogance of the well-born. She opened the civil service examinations to men of talent, regardless of their family background, creating a new class of scholars loyal only to her. She proposed 12 reforms to the emperor, policies that showed a deep understanding of the agrarian backbone of the empire. She lowered taxes for the peasantry, encouraged silk production, and, in a move that stunned the Confucian scholars, demanded that the mourning period for a mother be equal to that of a father. It was a subtle, philosophical shift, a declaration that the feminine contribution to life and lineage was of equal weight to the masculine. She was rewriting the DNA of society, step by measured step. As the years of the two sages stretched on, Wu began to reshape not just the laws, but the very language of the empire. She felt that the existing words were insufficient to describe the new era she was forging. She gathered scholars to the north gate of the palace, bypassing the regular bureaucracy, and tasked them with creating new characters, the Zetian characters. She sought to imprint her will onto the written word itself. The most famous of these was her chosen name. She cast aside Mei Niang and the titles given by men. She chose the name Zhao. The character was a bold invention. The sun and the moon placed together in the sky, reigning over the empty space beneath. It symbolized a cosmic alignment, a brightness that illuminated every corner of the earth. It was a declaration of her nature. She was not merely the moon reflecting the sun's light. She was a luminary in her own right, sharing the heavens. The atmosphere of the court changed under her influence. The fragile, willow-waisted beauty standards of the past gave way to a preference for vitality and strength. The empress herself was described as having a dragon-like presence, with full cheeks and a gaze that could pin a general to the floor. She adorned the palace with Buddhist imagery, slowly steering the spiritual narrative of the empire away from the patriarchal strictures of Confucianism and toward a faith that offered more fluidity. She commissioned the carving of massive grottos where the face of the great Vairocana Buddha was smoothed and rounded to resemble her own, a stone testament to her divinity gazing serenely over the river. By the time Gaoson passed away in 683, the transition was already complete in all but name. The grieving widow did not retire to the background. Her sons, now grown, found themselves to be emperors in title only, puppets dancing on the strings held by their mother. When her son, the Emperor Zhongzhong, attempted to assert his independence by promoting his father-in-law, Wu moved with the speed of the iron whip. In a stunning display of power, she had the emperor dragged from the throne by her palace guards and demoted to a prince. The court watched in stunned silence. The message was clear. The mandate of heaven did not reside in the blood of the Li clan alone. It resided in the capability of the one who held the scepter. The screen that had once hidden her was effectively gone, though she had not yet taken the final unthinkable step. The air in the capital was electric with anticipation and dread. The sun and the moon were no longer sharing the sky. The moon was eclipsing the sun, and the world waited in the breathless dark to see what new dawn would break. She stood now at the precipice of the impossible. The secret police had silenced her enemies, the bureaucracy was filled with her scholars, and the people prospered under her efficient hand. But the title of Huangdi Emperor was a wall that had never been breached by a woman. To cross it would require more than political maneuvering. It would require a divine intervention, a rewriting of prophecy, and the audacity to stare down history itself. As the wind howled through the pagodas of Luoyang, Wu Zetian looked toward the great cloud temple, where the monks were busy finding or forging the ancient sutras that would justify her ultimate transformation. The heavy, cloying scent of sandalwood incense drifted through the carved lattice windows of the imperial palace, carrying with it the chanting of 1,000 monks. It was a sound that had become the heartbeat of Luoyang, a rhythmic, deep-throated drone that vibrated against the very foundations of the Tang court. Wu Zetian sat in the dim light of her private study, the air around her thick with the smoke of prayer and the weight of destiny. The silence of the night was not empty. It was filled with the scratching of brushes against silk and the distant, ceaseless labor of stonecutters along the banks of the Yi River. She was no longer merely the power behind the curtain or the whisper in the emperor's ear. She was the architect of a new world, and the blueprint lay unrolled before her on the lacquered table. For decades, the rigid structures of Confucianism had sought to confine her. The ancient scholars, with their long beards and narrow texts, preached a cosmic order where the heavens were male and the earth was female, where the ruler was the sun and the consort the moon, never to be equal, never to eclipse. They cited history as a cage, claiming that a woman, ruling as the son of heaven, would be as unnatural as a hen crowing at dawn. But Weltan had studied history too, perhaps better than any of them. She remembered the lessons of her father, the timber merchant, who had seen the spark in her eyes and given her scrolls instead of embroidery needles. She knew that history was not a cage, but a river, and rivers could be diverted if one had the will to move the earth. If the Confucian heaven had no place for her, she would look to a higher sky. She turned her gaze to the teachings of the Buddha, whose compassion was vast enough to encompass all forms, all beings, and all possibilities. In the libraries of the Great Cloud Temple, her scholars men she had hand-picked for their brilliance and their flexibility had found the key she required. It was written in the Great Cloud Sutra, a text that spoke of a female deity, a Devi of pure light who would descend to the mortal realm to reign as a universal monarch. This Devi would not be a usurper, but a bodhisattva, a compassionate savior arriving to guide the world into an era of perfect peace. Wu traced the characters of the sutra with a fingernail that was as sharp as a dagger. The prophecy was clear. It was not ambition that drove her. It was karma. It was the turning of the great wheel. To manifest this divine truth, she ordered the earth itself to be reshaped. Miles away, along the limestone cliffs of Longmen, an army of artisans was carving her vision into the living rock. They were creating the Feng Xian Temple, a shrine of such scale that it would dwarf the ambitions of all men who came before her. The central figure, the massive Vairocana Buddha, rose nearly 60 feet into the air. Its limestone face, smooth and serene, gazed out over the river with eyes that saw past the horizon. It was an open secret in the court, whispered with a mixture of awe and terror, that the face of the Buddha was the face of Wu Zetian herself. She had given the artisans her own visage, the broad, intelligent forehead, the full, commanding cheeks, the eyes that held both the tranquility of enlightenment and the terrifying resolve of absolute power. By merging her image with the divine, she was no longer asking for permission to rule. She was revealing that her rule was mandated by the cosmos. Yet, even as she ascended toward godhood, she remained the talented secretary who had once organized the imperial archives. Her mind was a fortress of intellect, sharpened by years of navigating the treacherous currents of the court. She remembered the days of her youth, standing in the stables of Emperor Taizong, looking at the untamable horse called Lion Stallion. She recalled the shock on the emperor's face when she, a mere slip of a girl, had offered to break the beast. First, an iron whip, she had said, then an iron mace, and if he still will not submit, a dagger to the throat. The memory played in her mind like a parable. The world was that wild horse. She had used the whip of discipline and the mace of her secret police to break the aristocracy that despised her. Now she held the dagger, not to kill, but to carve a new name into the flesh of the empire. Her governance was as precise as her calligraphy. While the old guard grumbled about tradition, she unleashed a torrent of reforms known as the 12 Suggestions. She looked at the fields where the peasants toiled and saw the true strength of the state. She lowered their taxes, encouraged new methods of farming, and gave land to those who would work it. She saw the weeping of daughters who were told their grief mattered less than a son's, and she rewrote the laws of mourning, decreeing that a mother's death demanded the same 3 years of reverence as a father's. It was a subtle shift, a quiet revolution of the heart, placing the feminine on equal footing with the masculine in the most sacred of family duties. She was winning the people, not just with fear, but with a competence that the bloated aristocracy could never match. To rule a new world, she needed a new language. The old words were stained with the prejudices of the past, so she took up her brush and began to invent. She created new characters, logographs that had never existed before, forcing the bureaucracy to write in her script. The most powerful of these was her own chosen name, Zhao. It was a magnificent, complex character composed of the symbols for the sun and the moon placed together above the sky. In this single stroke of ink, she dismantled the binary that had governed China for thousands of years. The sun and moon were no longer separate entities chasing each other across the firmament. They were united, shining together, illuminating the emptiness of the sky. She was both the radiant warmth of the sun and the cool, illuminating light of the moon. She was the shell, the celestial brightness that permeated everything. The atmosphere in the capital shifted from anticipation to a reverent hush. The secret police, led by the terrifying Lai Yunchen, had done their work. The informer's box had been filled with accusations, and the grand old families, the ones who traced their lineage back for centuries and looked down on her merchant blood, had been pruned like dead branches from a tree. Silence reigned in the halls where dissent once echoed, but it was not the silence of the graveyard. It was the silence of a held breath, the pause before the thunder. The scholars of the North Gate, her personal think tank of poets and intellectuals, worked through the night drafting the edicts that would announce the impossible. They composed poetry that extolled the virtues of the coming era, weaving the Great Cloud Sutra into the legal code of the land. Wu Zetian stood and walked to the balcony of her pavilion. Below her, the city of Luyang was a sea of lanterns, a reflection of the starry sky above. She felt the weight of the imperial robes she would soon wear, not the dragon robes of the Tang, but the golden and crimson vestments of her own dynasty, the Zhou. She was 67 years old, an age when most women were grandmothers fading into the background of their family halls. Yet she felt a vitality coursing through her that was sharper and more vibrant than in her youth. The beauty of the glamorous Main Yang had evolved into the majestic presence of the holy and divine emperor. She did not need the delicate, bird-like frailty that the poets admired in palace dancers. She possessed the heavy, grounded power of the earth itself, the man-like strength that the Tang era secretly respected. The wind shifted, blowing the smoke of the incense away, clearing the air. The moon hung high and full, its light bathing the palace rooftops in silver. The transition was no longer a question of if, but now. The silk screen was gone. The shadow was gone. There was only the light. She turned back to the room, where a fresh robe lay waiting. It was time to step out of the inner quarters and ascend the steps to the dragon throne, not as a regent, not as a widow, but as the one true sovereign. The ink was dry on the page. The character Zhao was written. The scent of incense faded, replaced by the crisp, cold air of a new dawn, a dawn that rose not on the Tang dynasty, but on the era of Wu. The doors to the great hall began to creak open, the sound echoing like the turning of a massive page in the book of time. The massive doors of the great hall settled into their open position, revealing the vast expanse of the imperial court. Yet the journey to this threshold had not been walked on stone or silk alone. It had been paved with silence, the silence of patience, the silence of the monastery, and the terrible, suffocating silence of a nursery that no longer held the sound of breath. As the newly anointed emperor stood before the precipice of supreme power, the echoes of the past swirled in the drafty corridors, whispering the true cost of the crown. To understand the sun and moon over the sky, one had to first understand the shadows from which the light had violently emerged. Decades prior, long before the golden robes and the heavy diadem, there had been only a young girl named Mei Niang, standing in the imperial stables of Emperor Taizong. Even then, the air around her carried a static charge, a refusal to bend that unsettled the seasoned warriors of the Tang court. They spoke of a wild horse, a beast known as lion stallion, which no man can tame. The creature was a storm of muscle and fury, rejecting every rider, its eyes rolling with a madness that mirrored the chaotic frontier. The young concubine, merely a secretary then, had not lowered her eyes as expected. She had stepped forward with a voice like sheared ice. She told the Son of Heaven that she could master the beast, but her request for tools was not for sugar or hay. She asked for an iron whip, an iron mace, and a dagger. The court had fallen quiet, the brutality of the suggestion hanging in the perfumed air. If the whip failed to break the spirit, the mace would break the head. And if the mace failed, the dagger would cut the throat. It was a manifesto of absolute will, submission or annihilation. There was no middle ground, no negotiation with chaos. Emperor Taizong had looked upon her then not with desire, but with a deep, primal wariness. He saw the steel spine beneath the silk, a terrifying competence that did not belong in the inner quarters. But steel, if not tempered, is cast aside. When Taizong passed into the Great Void, the fiery Main Yang was banished to the Ganei temple, her head shaved, her silks replaced by the coarse grey robes of a nun. The walls of the temple were meant to be her tomb, a place where childless concubines faded into chanting and incense, forgotten by the world. Yet, the chant of the sutras could not drown out the ambition that thrummed in her blood. She did not pray for salvation. She planned for resurrection, and it came in the form of the new emperor, Gaosong, the son of her former master. Gaosong was a man of softer clay, prone to dizzy spells, and ruled by a heart that sought comfort over conquest. He remembered the captivating Main Yang, and when he visited the temple to offer incense for his father, their eyes met across the flickering candlelight. It was a violation of every right and taboo a son claiming his father's woman, but the pull was irresistible. The Empress Wang, the reigning matriarch of the palace, saw an opportunity. She was barren, losing favor to the lush and arrogant consort Xiahou. In a fatal miscalculation, Empress Wang advocated for Wu's return, thinking she could use this former concubine as a pawn to distract the emperor from consort Xiao. She believed she was bringing a dog to hunt a fox, never realizing she had invited a tigress into the fold. Wu returned to the palace, her hair grown back, her grey robes shed for the vibrant hues of the court. But she was no longer just the glamorous one. She was a survivor of the void. She moved with a calculated grace, serving the empress with humility while quietly weaving a web of alliances. She saw the palace not as a home, but as a battlefield of whispers. The inner court was a suffocating place, thick with the smell of lily powder and stagnant ambition, where a smile was often the prelude to a betrayal. The rivalry between Empress Wang and Consort Xiao was a noisy, distracting war. They fought with insults and petty grievances, blind to the true threat rising from the floorboards. Wu Zetian fought with something far more potent: fertility and the terrifying resolve to sacrifice everything. The turning point arrived in the humid summer of 654 CE. The air hung heavy and still over the imperial gardens, the cicadas screeching a frantic rhythm. Wu had given birth to a daughter, a small, fragile life that represented the solidification of her bond with Emperor Gaosong. The infant was a jewel, a promise of the future, resting in a cradle of lacquered wood and embroidered silk. One afternoon, Empress Wang visited Wu's quarters. The visit was ostensibly one of courtesy, a display of the empress's benevolence toward a lower-ranking consort. The empress played with the child, cooing over the cradle, perhaps feeling the sharp pang of her own barrenness before departing the chamber. The room fell quiet again, the heavy curtains dampening the light. What happened in the moments that followed remains locked in the darkest corridor of history, a secret kept between the mother and the shadows. When Wu returned to the room, followed shortly by Emperor Gaozong, the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt colder, stripped of life. Wu walked to the cradle, a smile on her lips, ready to present the child to her father. She pulled back the silken coverlet. The scream that tore from her throat shattered the decorum of the palace. It was a raw, animal sound of grief that brought the attendants rushing in. The infant lay still, her face pale, the tiny chest motionless. There was no breath. The cradle, once a vessel of hope, had become a silent coffin. Gaosong, trembling and weeping, demanded to know who had been there. The attendants, terrified and shaking, whispered the only name they had seen: the Empress. Empress Wang was just here, they stammered. She was alone with the child. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. The Emperor's grief curdled instantly into a black rage. In his mind, the narrative was clear. The jealous, barren Empress, threatened by Wu's fertility, had snuffed out the life of his daughter. He saw a monster where he once saw a wife. Historians would later debate the truth in hushed tones, wondering if the Empress had truly committed the crime, or if Wu, in a moment of supreme, horrifying calculation, had sacrificed her own flesh and blood to destroy her rival? Had she applied the lesson of the wild horse using the dagger when the whip failed? The truth was buried with the child, but the result was undeniable. The death of the infant was the death knell for the old order. The cradle's silence was the loudest sound the empire had ever heard. The aftermath was a descent into a nightmare for Wu's enemies. The emperor, fueled by the conviction of the empress's guilt, finally resolved to depose her. But Wu was not satisfied with mere deposition. The iron whip mentality required total erasure. Empress Wang and consort Xiao were stripped of their titles, demoted to commoners, and imprisoned in a dark, sealed chamber within the palace, fed only through a small hole in the wall. Yet even in darkness they were dangerous. The emperor, his heart prone to wavering, visited their prison one day, calling out to them with a lingering tenderness, referring to them by their old titles. He promised to improve their conditions. When news of this mercy reached Wu, the temperature in her quarters dropped to absolute zero. Mercy was a crack in the dam. Mercy was how dynasties fell. She ordered a punishment that would ensure no ghost could ever rise to challenge her again. The orders were given with the calm precision of a master calligrapher. Wang and Xiao were dragged from their cell. They were beaten with a distinct, rhythmic brutality, flayed until the ground was slick with their blood. But the horror did not end with the lash. In a final act of grotesque symbolism, Wu ordered their hands and feet severed. As the former empress and consort lay in agony, reduced to bleeding torsos, Wu had them cast into large vats of wine. The alcohol stung the raw wounds with a fire deeper than burning. A torture designed to prolong life in the midst of hell. Wu stood over the vats, her face impassive, observing the submerged, writhing forms. "Let their bones become drunken to the marrow," she reportedly said, her voice devoid of inflection. It was a warning written in blood and wine to the entire court. The era of gentle concubines was over. The woman who now stood beside the emperor was not merely a partner. She was a force of nature, willing to endure the death of her own child and inflict unimaginable suffering to secure the throne. Empress Wang died within days. Consort Xiao, before her end, cursed Wu, swearing to be reborn as a cat to tear out Wu's throat, for Wu had been born in the year of the rat. It was said that from that day forward, no cats were allowed in the imperial palace, a small superstitious ripple in the vast ocean of Wu's command. With the rivals liquidated and the aristocracy trembling in horror, the path was cleared. In 655 CE, the crown of the empress was placed upon Wu's head. The ceremony was grand, the incense billowing in thick clouds to mask the scent of blood that seemed to cling to the palace stones. She sat beside Gaozong, no longer below him. She was the mother of the heir, the survivor of the temple, the tamer of the stallion. But as she looked out over the prostrate officials, many of whom secretly despised her as a usurper and a murderess, she knew that fear was a potent but brittle tool. The silence of the cradle had propelled her here, but the silence of the court was not yet absolute. There were still whispers in the tea-houses, murmurs among the old clans of the northwest who viewed her as a timber merchant's daughter playing dress-up. They did not understand that she was not playing. They did not understand that she was rewriting the very language of power. As the years began to blur, Emperor Gaozong's health waned. The headaches that plagued him grew worse, his vision blurring, his strength sapping away like water into sand. He became a phantom in his own court, a figurehead drifting through the fog of illness. And as the light faded from the emperor, it grew brighter behind the silk screen that separated the throne from the inner sanctum. Wu began to sit behind this screen during court sessions, a silhouette against the silk. When the ministers spoke, they spoke to the emperor, but the voice that answered, sharp, decisive, and terrifyingly intelligent, was hers. They called them the two sages, a duality of power, but everyone knew the truth. The sun was setting and the moon was rising not to reflect the light, but to generate its own. She began to implement the reforms she had long studied in the solitude of the archives. She saw the bloated aristocracy, fat on hereditary privilege, and she sharpened her knife. She drafted the 12 suggestions, a proposal that seemed modest on the surface but was revolutionary in its core. She encouraged agriculture, the backbone of the empire, and she lightened the tax burden on the peasantry. She knew that if the roots were strong, the tree would survive the storm, even if the branches, the nobles, were pruned away. Most radically, she struck at the heart of the Confucian patriarchal order. She demanded that the mourning period for a mother be equal to that of a father, 3 years. It was a subtle administrative change, but it sent a shockwave through the empire's philosophy. It was a declaration that the womb was equal to the seed, that the feminine was not a secondary state of being, but a pillar of existence. Yet, policy alone could not protect her from the knives in the dark. The silent cradle had taught her that intimacy was the most dangerous vulnerability. She needed eyes everywhere. She needed to hear the thoughts of men before they were spoken. And so, as the two sages ruled, Wu began to construct a mechanism of surveillance that would turn the entire empire into a panopticon. She looked toward the shadows of the capital, seeking men who had no lineage to protect, men whose hunger matched her own. The wind outside the palace picked up, rattling the lattice windows, sounding like the scratching of 1,000 claws. The memory of the wine vats and the silent nursery faded, replaced by the cold reality of administration. The foundation had been poured. Now, the walls of the fortress had to be built. Stone by stone, spy by spy. The silence she had once endured would now be the weapon she wielded against the world. The silence she had once endured would now be the weapon she wielded against the world. A silence not of submission, but of listening. It was in the year 660 that the fragile mortal coil of Emperor Gaozong began to fray, transforming the dynamics of the Tang court forever. The emperor, a man of gentle disposition and genuine affection, was struck by a vertiginous ailment, a windstroke that clouded his vision and left his limbs heavy with a paralyzing numbness. The vibrant world of the court blurred into a headache-induced fog, and the endless streams of calligraphy on the state petitions became indecipherable grey smudges before his eyes. He could no longer bear the weight of the sun, nor the weight of the crown, without stumbling. In this twilight of his vitality, he turned not to his ministers, whose eyes concealed judgment, but to the one person whose strength had always been the scaffold for his own. He turned to Mei Niang, his Empress Wu. It was then that the physical arrangement of the imperial throne room shifted to match the reality of the empire's governance. A screen was lowered behind the dragon throne. This was no ordinary partition. It was a masterpiece of shimmering silk, translucent enough to allow the glow of lamplight to pass through, yet opaque enough to obscure the figure seated behind it. To the ministers kneeling on the polished stone floors, the emperor remained the visible figurehead, the Son of Heaven seated in his robes of yellow brocade. But just behind him, veiled by that pearl-coloured gauze, sat the Empress. She became the invisible architect of his reign, her voice a low murmur that only he could hear, guiding his hand, deciphering the complexities of tax law and military strategy that now eluded his aching mind. They became known as the Two Sages. It was a title that whispered of harmony, of a celestial balance between yin and yang. But in the corridors of the palace, the truth was heavier. The ministers knew that when they spoke to the emperor, they were speaking to a silhouette, and the answer they received, clear, decisive, and often ruthless, originated from the shadow behind the silk. The screen was a barrier, but it was also a lens, magnifying her intellect while shielding her from the direct gaze of those who still believed a woman's place was in the inner quarters, not the inner sanctum of statecraft. From this position of obscured omnipresence, Wu began to reshape the very fabric of Chinese society. She did not rule merely by whim. She ruled with a terrifying competence that left her detractors with little ammunition other than their prejudices. She remembered the lessons of her father, the timber merchant who had taught her the value of structure and the importance of a solid foundation. She looked out at the vast agrarian sprawl of the empire and saw that the strength of the Tang did not lie in the poetry of the aristocrats, but in the soil tilled by the common farmer. In a stroke of administrative brilliance, she drafted the 12 suggestions. These were not vague platitudes, but concrete reforms that touched the earth itself. She ordered a reduction in taxes for the peasantry, understanding that a starving populace is a rebellious one, while a fed populace is the bedrock of stability. She encouraged new methods of agriculture, turning her eyes to the harvest yields and irrigation channels, the unglamorous veins of the empire. But her most profound challenge to the old order was buried within the rituals of death. For centuries, the Confucian code had dictated that a son mourn his father for 3 years, a period of deep, structured grief that cemented the patriarch's status as the center of the universe. A mother, however, was accorded only a fraction of this reverence. Wu, from behind her silk fortress, penned a new decree. The mourning period for a mother would henceforth be equal to that of a father. It was a shock wave sent through the bedrock of tradition. By elevating the mother in death, she elevated the woman in life. She was rewriting the spiritual hierarchy of the family, subtly insisting that the womb that gave life was equal to the name that gave status. It was a policy born of personal conviction, but also of political necessity, for she was the ultimate mother of the state, and she demanded the mourning of the world. Yet benevolence was only one hand of the bodhisattva. The other hand held the sword. The aristocracy, the old families of the Northwest who traced their lineages back hundreds of years, viewed her as an intruder. They saw her as the merchant's daughter, the usurper who had worn the robes of a nun and now wore the robes of a sage. Their whispers in the tea-houses and the courtyards were venomous, speaking of her past, of the infant daughter who had died, of the sorcery she must have used to beguile the emperor. Wu knew that she could not govern if she was constantly looking over her shoulder. If the aristocracy would not bow to her brilliance, they would bow to her terror. She realized that to survive she needed to bypass the traditional bureaucracy, which was filled with men loyal to the old ways. She needed a new instrument, sharp and unencumbered by morality. She found this instrument in the rise of the cruel officials, men like Lai Yunchen, individuals who had no illustrious family names to protect, men whose only loyalty was to the hand that fed them power. Under her guidance, a new institution of surveillance was born, foreshadowing the spy networks of empires yet to come. The symbol of this new era was a simple, terrifying object, the copper box, designed with a slit that allowed petitions to be inserted but not retrieved. These boxes were placed in the capital, open to anyone. It was the democratization of betrayal. Any citizen, from the lowliest stable boy to the aggrieved clerk, could cast a suspicion into the box anonymously. They could report treason, conspiracy, or mere dissatisfaction among their masters. The wind that rattled the windows of the palace now carried the scent of paranoia. The great families, who had once felt untouchable in their walled compounds, suddenly found their servants watching them with new intent. A casual critique of the empress spoken over wine could end up in the copper box by morning. The result was a suffocating silence among the elite, a stillness that mirrored the discipline of the monastery Wu had once inhabited. This silent cradle had expanded. Now the entire capital held its breath. Lai Yunchen and his cohorts converted the secret police into an industrial machine of interrogation. They wrote manuals on the art of entrapment, creating a labyrinth of legalism where innocence was merely a failure of the imagination. For the old aristocracy, it was a nightmare. For Wu, it was a necessary cleansing. She was weeding the garden, pulling up the deep, tangled roots of the old guard so that a new order could breathe. It was brutal, efficient, and undeniably effective. The voices that had whispered against her were one by one silenced, not always by death, but often by the sheer, paralyzing fear of being named. Yet, even as she tightened her grip on the mortal realm, Wu looked toward the eternal. She understood that terror controls the body, but awe controls the soul. She needed a legitimacy that transcended the Confucian laws of men, laws that were inherently stacked against her gender. If the texts of the sages would not support a female ruler, she would find new texts. She would find new gods. She turned her gaze to the West, to the teachings of the Buddha. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of the Confucian court, Buddhism offered a fluidity, a a promise of universal salvation that did not strictly discriminate between male and female forms. Her scholars, the Northgate scholars, whom she had gathered as a personal think tank to bypass the regular government, began to circulate the Great Cloud Sutra. This text contained a prophecy that the Maitreya Buddha, the future Buddha who would bring an age of perfect peace, would reincarnate in the body of a woman. Wu did not merely suggest this prophecy, she embodied it. She began to shape the physical landscape of the empire to reflect this divine mandate. In the limestone cliffs of Longmen, near the city of Loyang, a massive undertaking began. Thousands of artisans were commissioned to carve the living rock, chipping away the mountain to reveal the god sleeping within. The dust of the excavation rose like incense smoke, coating the valley in a pale haze. Day and night, the sound of hammers against stone echoed like a heartbeat. Slowly, the great figure emerged. The Vairakana Buddha. It was a colossus, seated in serene majesty, rising over 55 feet into the air. But it was the face of the statue that caused the pilgrims to gasp and the courtiers to tremble. The face was not an abstract ideal of divinity. It possessed a broad, square forehead, full, rounded cheeks, and eyes that held a gaze of compassionate but absolute authority. It was a face that mirrored the descriptions of Wu herself. She had cast her own image into the stone, fusing her identity with the cosmos. In the Tang dynasty, beauty was not defined by the waif-like fragility of later eras. It was defined by presence, by a certain fullness that signified health and power. Wu was described as having a big face and a dragon-like gaze, features she bequeathed to the Buddha. By carving her likeness into the holy mountain, she was making a statement that no copper box or secret police could achieve. She was declaring that her rule was not a temporary aberration, but a manifestation of cosmic will. When the common people looked up at the giant stone face, they saw the Empress watching over them, eternal, unblinking, and serene. She was becoming the holy and divine, a figure who bridged the gap between the silk screen of the palace and the open sky of the heavens. The two sages ruled for 23 years, but as the years wore on, the emperor faded further into the background, a ghost in his own court. The stroke had left him frail, and he became increasingly dependent on the vitality of his wife. She was the sun to his waning moon, and she began to invent her own language to describe this new reality. She introduced new characters into the written script, the Zetian characters. She realized that to truly own the world, one must own the words used to describe it. She chose a new name for herself, Zawal, a character of her own invention. It combined the symbols for the sun and the moon hanging together over the empty sky. It was a name that claimed total illumination. She was not just the moon reflecting the sun's light. She was the source of light itself. As the wind settled outside the palace and the candles burned low behind a silk screen, Wu sat in the quiet center of the web she had spun. She had mastered the wild horse of the empire. She had used the iron whip of the law, the iron mace of the secret police, and now she held the dagger of absolute sovereignty. The two sages' era was drawing to a close, not by political defeat, but by the inevitable march of mortality. Gaosong's breath was growing shallow, his grip on the world loosening with every passing season. The shield of his name was thinning. Soon there would be no emperor to sit in front of the screen. Soon the screen itself would have to fall, and she would have to stand revealed, not as a voice in the shadow, nor as a wife, nor even as a mother. The time was approaching for the final metamorphosis, for the concubine to step past the throne and become the heaven itself. The whispers of the court had ceased, replaced by a waiting silence, the kind of heavy, charged stillness that precedes the breaking of a storm. The heavy curtains of the imperial bedchamber ceased their gentle swaying as the last breath left Emperor Gaozong's body. It was the quiet exit for a man who had lived so long in the colossal shadow of his wife, a passing that felt less like a sudden rupture and more like the final setting of a winter sun. The palace did not erupt into chaos, for chaos requires a vacuum, and there was no vacuum here. The space where the emperor had stood was already filled. Wu sat by the bedside, her face a mask of composed sorrow, her eyes dry and terrifyingly clear. The silk screen that had separated her from the court for 2 decades was now merely a piece of furniture. There was no longer a need to whisper into a man's ear so that he might speak with her voice. The conduit was gone. She was the voice. The transition to morning white washed over the forbidden city like a snowfall. Banners of imperial yellow were furled and replaced by the stark, ghostly pale of grief. Yet beneath the sombre rituals, the machinery of the state ground on without a stutter. Her sons, technically the heirs, were fragile reeds in a gale, trembling before the weight of the crown and the gaze of their mother. They sat upon the throne in name, but the brush that signed the edicts, the mind that moved the generals, and the will that held the Tang dynasty together remained entirely hers. Yet the old aristocracy, the families of the Northwest with their ancient lineages and rigid Confucian hearts, saw an opening. They whispered that a woman could rule from behind a screen, but she could never stand beneath the open sky as the Son of Heaven. Wu sensed the shifting tides of loyalty, just as a mariner senses a coming storm in the drop of air pressure. She knew that to maintain order, the tools of the past, the iron whip and the mace, were too crude. She needed something pervasive, something that lived not in the hand of a guard, but in the mind of every subject. She needed a bronze box. It appeared first in the capital, a curious and ominous object placed in the public square, gleaming with a dull luster of copper. This was the informer's box. It was designed with 4 slots, each accepting petitions and accusations from the 4 corners of the world. It was a stroke of psychological genius. It invited the common peasant, the disgruntled servant, and the overlooked scholar to bypass the entire bureaucratic hierarchy and speak directly to the Empress Dowager. It democratized suspicion. Suddenly, the high walls of the aristocratic estates were no longer barriers against scrutiny. A whisper in a tea-house, a careless jest at a banquet, or a private complaint about the female ruler could find its way into the bronze maw of the box. To process this flood of secrets, Wu unleashed a new breed of official, men who existed outside the traditional moralities of the court. Foremost among them was Lai Junchen, a man of exquisite cruelty and legalistic brilliance. He was the spider who sat at the center of this new web. Under Lai's guidance, the secret police became the phantoms of Luoyang. They moved through the city like smoke, turning the bronze box's contents into indictments. The old guard, the princes of the Li bloodline, who had sneered at the merchant's daughter, began to vanish. Confessions were extracted with terrifying efficiency, often detailing grand conspiracies that may or may not have existed, but whose uncovering served to cleanse the court of dissent. The air in the capital grew heavy, with a paranoia that was almost tangible, a thick fog where trust dissolved. Yet, to the common people, this reign of terror was distant thunder. They saw only that the corrupt officials who had taxed them were being humbled, that the untouchable lords were trembling. To the peasantry, the bronze box was not an instrument of fear, but of justice, that fear alone builds a brittle throne. Wu knew that true power, the kind that endures for centuries, requires legitimacy. It requires the sanction of the divine. The Confucian scholars, bound by texts that relegated women to the inner chambers, would never grant her this. Their book said a hen should not herald the dawn. So Wu looked past them, turning her gaze toward the West, toward the incense-wreath philosophy of Buddhism. If the old texts denied her, she would find new texts. She found her mandate in the Great Cloud Sutra. With the help of ambitious monks who saw a patron in the dowager, a commentary was discovered, or perhaps conveniently illuminated, that spoke of a female divinity, the Maitreya, a Buddha of the future who would descend to earth to rule a kingdom of unparalleled prosperity. This deity would have the body of a woman, but the spirit of a universal monarch. The prophecy fit her as perfectly as a tailored robe. To cement this divine association, Wu ordered the earth itself to be reshaped. Along the banks of the Yi River, where the limestone cliffs rose sheer and grey, the sound of chisels began to ring out, a rhythmic heartbeat that would continue for years. At the Longmen Grottos, a massive undertaking began. Thousands of artisans hung from ropes, carving into the living rock to release the form of the Vairocana Buddha. As the dust settled and the scaffolding fell away, the face that emerged from the cliffside was colossal, 17 meters high, serene and omnipotent. It possessed the big face, the full cheeks, and the crescent eyes that the poets attributed to Wu herself. It was a visage of maternal power, terrifying in its size but gentle in its expression. The statue did not look at the viewer. It looked past them, toward eternity, its gaze encompassing the river, the mountains, and the empire. When the people looked up at the Vairocana, they saw the Buddha, but they also saw their empress. She was no longer just the widow of Gaosong. She was becoming an icon, carved into the very geology of China, while the secret police silenced her enemies and the stonemasons carved her divinity. Wu's mind turned to the administration of the realm. She was a workhorse of governance, possessed of an inexhaustible energy that shamed men half her age. She revisited the 12 suggestions she had drafted years ago, turning proposals into law. She looked at the fields, the bedrock of the empire's wealth, and saw the suffering of the farmers. She slashed the taxes that burdened them and commissioned new treatises on agriculture, disseminating knowledge on irrigation and crop rotation to the furthest provinces. The harvest yield swelled and the granaries filled. She looked at the social order and saw the imbalance of grief. For centuries, a son was required to mourn his father for 3 years, but his mother for only 1. It was a final stinging insult to the woman who had birthed him, a declaration that her loss was of lesser consequence. With a stroke of her brush, Wu equalized the mourning period. Henceforth, a mother's death would demand the same 3 years of reverence as a father's. It was a subtle shift in the tectonic plates of culture, a signal to every household in China that the feminine was no longer secondary. Her intellect was restless, unsatisfied with merely ruling the world as it was. She sought to redefine the very language used to describe it. The written characters of Chinese were sacred, ancient vessels of meaning. Wu decided that they too must bow to her era. She invented new characters, the Zetian characters, logographs that existed only because she willed them to. She stripped the old word for star and replaced it with a circle. She redesigned earth, year, and day, but the most significant change was her own name. She cast aside the names given to her by fathers and husbands. She chose a new character, one of her own creation, Zhao. It was a magnificent, complex structure, depicting the sun and the moon hanging together over the open sky. It symbolized a brilliance that illuminated everything, a dominance that recognized no day or night, only a perpetual radiant present. By taking this name, she was stating that she was not merely a ruler under the heavens. She was the sky itself, holding both the masculine sun and the feminine moon in perfect, suspended balance. The court had quieted. The purges of the secret police had done their work, leaving a bureaucracy that was terrified, efficient, and populated by men who owed their positions solely to her meritocratic exams. The North Gate scholars, her private think tank of poets and intellectuals, churned out literature and edicts that polished her image to a blinding sheen. The old aristocratic families were broken, their influence scattered like autumn leaves. The common people, well fed and protected from corrupt magistrates, chanted her name with reverence. The bronze box had caught the whispers. The stone Buddha had caught the prayers. The new characters had caught the mind. Wu stood on the high terrace of the palace, the wind tugging at her heavy, embroidered sleeves. She was 66 years old. Most women of her age were grandmothers fading into the quiet corners of their family homes, tending to household shrines. Wu was preparing to set fire to the dynasty. The Tang dynasty, the legacy of the Li family, was a skin she had worn for 40 years. It had served its purpose. It was time to shed it. The silence of the palace was no longer the silence of mourning. It was the hush of an audience waiting for the curtain to rise on the final act. She looked out over the sprawling capital of Luoyang, the lanterns beginning to flicker to life as the twilight deepened. The sun had set, but the moon was rising. Her moon, She turned back toward the dark interior of the hall, where the dragon throne sat empty, waiting not for a regent, nor a dowager, nor a guardian. It waited for an emperor. The path was clear. The bronze box had snapped shut on the past. The scroll of history lay open, blank and inviting, waiting for the first stroke of her new brush. The era of the two sages was a memory. The era of the Zhou was about to begin. She moved toward the inner sanctum, her footsteps echoing with the steady, rhythmic precision of a ticking clock, counting down the final moments of the Tang, leading her toward the coronation that would defy 3,000 years of tradition. The echo of those footsteps did not merely bounce off the lacquered pillars, it seemed to ripple through the very fabric of the empire, a sound that had been building for decades, low and steady, like the heartbeat of a sleeping dragon finally stirring to wakefulness. She ascended the dais, the heavy ceremonial robes of the emperor trailing behind her, a cascade of imperial yellow that swallowed the stone steps. This was no longer the silk of a concubine, nor the sombre garb of a grieving widow. It was the vestment of the Son of Heaven, a title that heaven had never before bestowed upon a daughter. As she turned to face the great hall, the weight of the crown upon her head felt familiar, a burden she had carried in spirit long before she wore it in gold. She looked out at the sea of prostrate officials, their foreheads pressed to the cold floor, and in the hush of that massive chamber, her mind drifted back through the labyrinth of years that had led her to this singular, impossible height. She remembered the scent of ink and old paper in the study of Emperor Taizong decades ago, when she was merely a girl of 14. A fifth-rank talent named Mei Niang. They had called her the Glamorous then, a creature of beauty intended to adorn the background of powerful men. But while other consorts practiced the lute or embroidered peonies, she had stood by the emperor's desk, grinding ink, her eyes scanning the reports of state, her mind absorbing the machinery of governance. It was there in the quiet corners of the imperial study that she had first understood the nature of power. She recalled the day Taizong had spoken of a wild, unbreakable horse, a beast that no stable master could tame. She had stepped forward, a young girl with a voice like polished steel, and offered her solution. An iron whip, she had said. If that fails, an iron mace, and if that fails, a dagger to the throat. Taizong had stared at her, unsettled by the ruthlessness that gleamed in her eyes, a reflection of his own conqueror's spirit. He saw then that she was not a flower to be kept in a vase, but a blade sheathed in silk. That same steel now sat upon the dragon throne. She had used the whip of discipline. She had wielded the mace of authority during the years she ruled from behind the screen as one of the two sages, and now, for those who still dared to whisper against her, the dagger was drawn. The memory of the convent flickered through her mind to the Garnier temple, where she had been banished after Taizong's death, her head shaved, a life seemingly extinguished in the grey monotony of prayer and incense. It was the fate of childless concubines to fade into oblivion, to become living ghosts chanting sutras for the dead. But she had not faded. She had turned the silence of the temple into a cocoon, waiting for the young Emperor Gaosong to return, to reclaim her, to break every taboo of heaven and earth to bring her back. She had risen from the ashes of humility to the fire of the phoenix, and now she soared even higher beyond the phoenix, becoming the dragon itself. To rule as a woman in a world built by men required more than just political acumen. It required a rewriting of the cosmos. The Confucian scholars, those guardians of tradition who despised her, claimed that a hen crowing at dawn signaled the collapse of the family. To silence them, she did not merely argue, she changed the gods themselves. If the laws of men forbade her reign, she would appeal to the laws of the spirit. She turned her gaze inward, toward the spiritual architecture she had constructed to support her earthly throne. She had commanded the monks to find the Great Cloud Sutra, a text that prophesied the coming of a female deity, a matriarch who would descend to earth to bring about an age of utopian prosperity, a world without disease or worry, where the harvest was always plentiful. She was not a usurper. She was the fulfillment of prophecy, the holy and divine emperor ordained by the Buddha. This divinity needed a face, a monument that would outlast the fragile paper of edicts and the fleeting lives of critics. Her thoughts travelled hundreds of miles away to the limestone cliffs of Longmen, overlooking the Yi River. There, amidst the dust of chiselled stone and the rhythmic clinking of 1,000 hammers, her true likeness was being born. She had poured the treasury into the rock, commissioning the massive Vairocana Buddha, a colossus of serenity and power. The artisans, working under her strict guidance, carved the face of the cosmic Buddha, not as a generic deity, but with her own features. The statue rose from the cliffside, 44 feet of limestone divinity. It possessed a broad, square forehead, full cheeks that spoke of vitality and abundance, and eyes that were large, compassionate, yet terrifyingly all-seeing. It was a face of plump majesty, rejecting the dainty, fragile aesthetic of the court ladies for a beauty that conveyed strength, stability, and eternal presence. When the common people looked up at the Vairocana, they saw the Buddha, but they also saw Wu Zetian. She had etched herself into the geology of the empire, ensuring that long after her body had returned to dust, the mountains themselves would still bear her countenance, watching over the flow of the river and the flow of time. But stone was not the only thing she reshaped. She sought to control the very language her subjects spoke. To define a new era, one must define the words used to describe it. She introduced the Zetian characters, new logographs created to replace standard words, infusing them with her own philosophy. The most potent of these was her own chosen name, Zhao. In the air before her eyes, she traced the shape of it in her mind. The character was a masterpiece of symbolism, the sun and the moon placed together above the sky. Zhao. It meant that she was not merely beneath the heavens. She was the illuminating force that hung in the firmament, possessing the radiance of the sun and the mystery of the moon, shining over the emptiness of the sky. By forcing the bureaucracy to write this character, she forced every scholar, every clerk, and every petitioner to acknowledge her cosmic status with every stroke of their brush. She had literally written herself into the vocabulary of the civilization. Yet, for all this celestial radiance, the holy and divine emperor knew that the foundation of power on earth remained rooted in the soil and the blood of the mortal realm. Her reign was a paradox of benevolent light and terrifying shadow. To the farmers in the fields, she was a savior. She remembered the 12 suggestions she had drafted years ago, reforms that had lowered the crushing taxes on the peasantry, encouraged the planting of mulberries for silk, and elevated the status of women by demanding that a mother's mourning period equal that of a father. She saw the empire not just as a hierarchy of nobles, but as a vast, breathing organism that needed to be fed and nurtured. She stripped power from the bloated aristocracy of the Northwest, the old families who rested on their lineage like a crutch, and opened the examination halls to men of talent, regardless of their birth. She was the patron of the poet and the scholar, the Northgate scholars, who served as her intellectual vanguard, bypassing the sluggish bureaucracy to draft her will directly. But to those who stood in her way, the holy emperor was a figure of dread. The silence in the hall was maintained not just by reverence, but by the memory of the copper box. She had instituted a system of informants, a bronze urn with 4 slots into which anyone could drop a scroll, accusing a neighbor, a master, or a rival of treason. It was a mechanism of perfect paranoia. The secret police, led by the chillingly efficient La Yunchen, read these scrolls with voracious appetites. They were the hounds she had unleashed to hunt the wolves of the old guard. The aristocracy lived in fear of the midnight knock, the summons to the tribunal, the interrogation that had no end. She sat on the dragon throne, the convergence of these duality, the bodhisattva and the executioner. The air in the throne room was thick with incense, masking the metallic scent of fear that lingered in the sweat of the courtiers. She adjusted the heavy ceremonial hat, the pearls swaying with her slightest movement. She was 56 years old, yet she felt a vitality that belied her years, a fire fueled by the sheer impossibility of her existence. She had survived the jealousies of the inner palace, the strangulation of her own infant daughter, a sacrifice that still haunted the quietest hours of the night, the stroke that had felled her husband, and the treachery of her own sons. She looked down at her hands, resting on the carved armrests of the throne. They were smooth, strong hands, capable of holding the brush that wrote poetry, and the seal that condemned armies. The Tang dynasty was suspended, held in abeyance by her will. The Zhou dynasty had begun. She was the sun and the moon, the earth and the sky. She was the culmination of 3,000 years of history, and the solitary point upon which the future balanced. The courtiers began the chant, a low rumble that grew into a roar, vibrating through the floorboards, ascending to the rafters, and escaping out into the cooling twilight of Luoyang. Long live the holy and divine emperor. It was a sound that drowned out the whispers of the past, a sound that cemented the reality of the present. Wu Zetian closed her eyes for a fleeting second, inhaling the intoxicating vapor of absolute authority, before opening them again to survey her world. The lanterns were fully lit now, casting long dancing shadows that stretched toward the throne like supplicants reaching for salvation. She did not recoil from the shadows. She owned them just as she owned the light. The ceremony was concluding, but the true work, the cementing of a legacy that would baffle historians for a millennium, was only just beginning. She signaled for the scribe to approach, ready to dictate the first edict of the new age. The two sages were gone. There was only one. The scribe dipped his brush into the well of black ink, the bristles drinking the liquid night, and waited for the first words that would redefine the cosmos. But Wu Zetian did not speak immediately. She moved to the lattice window, pushing it open to allow the cool air of the Yi River valley to mingle with the incense of the palace. The silence in the room was heavy, not with hesitation, but with the gravity of a mountain settling into the earth. She knew that titles were fleeting things. An emperor was merely a title bestowed by men, and what men gave, men could take away. The scholars, with their rigid Confucian texts, whispered that a hen crowing at dawn signaled the ruin of the family. They looked at her and saw a violation of nature. She needed to become something more than a ruler. She needed to become an inevitability. She turned back to the scribe, her voice low and resonant, instructing him not in the language of the court, but in the language of the divine. She began to speak of the Great Cloud Sutra. If the old texts of China could not justify her rule, she would find new texts, ancient words from the distant west that spoke of a female deity, the Maitreya, who would descend to earth to usher in an era of golden prosperity. She would not just be the emperor, she would be the living vessel of the Buddha. The ink flowed onto the paper, sketching out a new reality where her ascension was not a usurpation, but a fulfillment of cosmic prophecy. This vision required more than paper. It required stone. It required a monument so vast, so undeniable, that 1,000 years of wind and rain could not erode her likeness from the memory of the world. Her mind travelled from the quiet of the study to the limestone cliffs of Longmen, the Dragon's Gate, just south of Luoyang. Here, the Yi River sliced through the mountains like a blade of green jade, flanked by towering rock faces that had been scarred by the chisels of pious men for centuries. But she would carve a scar deeper and more beautiful than any before. In the days that followed, the tranquility of the river valley was shattered by the symphony of ambition. Thousands of artisans, masons, and labourers descended upon the cliffs. From the palace, Wu Zetian diverted the entirety of her cosmetics allowance, a fortune that could have bought kingdoms, to fund the dust and noise of creation. She stripped herself of the vanities of paint and powder to clothe herself in the permanence of the mountain. The air at Longmen became thick with white dust, a fog of pulverized limestone that coated the workers' skin until they looked like ghosts moving against the grey rock. The sound was a rhythmic, unending thunder, the strike of iron on stone 1,000,000 times over, a heartbeat driven by the will of one woman. High up on the cliff face of Fengxian Temple, the great niche was hewed from the living rock, thick scaffolding made of bamboo rose like a skeletal forest, clinging to the precipice, allowing the carvers to reach the heavens. Slowly, under the guidance of the master sculptors, the form emerged. It was not merely a statue, it was a mountain transformed. The central figure, the Vairocana Buddha, the cosmic Buddha of boundless light, began to take shape. 17 meters of limestone was smoothed and polished until they resembled the softest flesh. But as the features were revealed, the courtiers who came to inspect the work fell silent. They recognized the curve of the eyebrows, arching like the wings of a moth. They knew the shape of the eyes, heavy-lidded, elongated, radiating a profound, terrifying serenity. They saw the mouth, small and full, ghosting a smile that was both compassionate and imperious. It was the face of the emperor. It was the face of Wu Zetian. She had ordered the artisans to cast the divine in her own image, collapsing the distance between the celestial and the terrestrial. In the Tang dynasty, beauty was not found in the starving, fragile forms of later centuries. The ideal was a robust vitality, a reflection of health and power. Wu Zetian possessed this in abundance. Records spoke of her dragon eyes and phoenix neck, her square forehead that suggested a vast intellect, and a face that was full like the harvest moon. She rejected the swallow-like frailty of the harem. She was the sun and the moon, a concept she would later capture in her own invented character, Zhao. The Vairocana Buddha sat with plump cheeks and a strong, rounded chin, a physique that commanded space rather than shrinking from it. It was a face that did not ask for permission to exist. It watched over the river with a gaze that seemed to penetrate the water and the souls of those who passed beneath it. By carving her visage into the holy rock, she was telling her subjects that to worship the Buddha was to worship her, and to obey her was to obey the natural order of the universe. Yet while the stone Buddha offered a smile of eternal compassion, the living Buddha in the palace ensured her survival through far less gentle means. The light of the Vairocana cast a long, dark shadow. To maintain the serenity of her rule, she had to dismantle the chaotic threats that lurked in the hearts of the aristocracy. The old guard, the families who traced their lineage back for centuries, viewed her as a merchant's daughter who had bewitched the throne. They plotted in the tea-houses and the secluded gardens. Wu Zetian countered their whispers with a silence of her own making. She unleashed a network of intelligence that permeated every level of society. At the center of this web sat men like Lai Yunchen, officials of terrifying efficiency, who oversaw the mechanisms of the secret police. They introduced the informer's box, a copper vessel placed in the public square where anyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest minister, could anonymously drop a scroll accusing another of treason. The box became a gaping maw that swallowed trust. A neighbor could report a neighbor, a son could report a father. The accusations led to the dark chambers of the tribunal of censors, where the air smelled of iron and fear, far removed from the incense of the Buddhist temples. The reign of terror was not a mindless slaughter, but a surgical removal of the roots that threatened to strangle her dynasty. She used the cruelty of men like Lai Yunchen as a tool, a dark mirror to the bright chisel of the masons at Longmen. One shaped the stone, the other shaped the court. She understood the duality of power better than any man who had sat on the dragon throne. A ruler could not be only the merciful bodhisattva, she must also be the wrathful guardian. The aristocracy crumbled. The great clans that had held the emperors hostage for generations were broken, their lands seized, their titles stripped. In their place, she promoted scholars from humble backgrounds, men chosen for their talent rather than their bloodline. She created a meritocracy born of necessity, forging a loyalty that belonged to her alone. As the years turned, the great statue at Longmen was completed. The scaffolding was stripped away, and the bamboo fell like shed skin, revealing the Grand Lucina in all its glory. Wu Zetian travelled to the site to consecrate the image. The procession was a river of silk and gold flowing from Luoyang, the banners snapping in the wind, the drums echoing off the canyon walls. She stood at the base of the cliff, a small figure in the shadow of her own colossal ambition. She looked up at the stone face, and the stone face looked down at her. The resemblance was undeniable, a secret shared between the woman and the rock. The sun caught the limestone, turning the Buddha's face to radiant white gold. In that moment, the murmurs of the court, the screams from the prison chambers, and the scratching of the scholars' pens all faded into the background. There was only the stillness of the stone. She had achieved what the Great Cloud Sutra had promised. She had brought a golden age, but it was forged in the fires of ruthlessness. The common people, who saw their taxes lowered and their sons given a chance to rise through the civil service exams, worshipped her. To them, she was indeed the Maitreya, the mother who provided. To the elites, she was a demoness. But standing there, breathing the dust of the valley, she knew that history would eventually lose its voice, leaving only the monument to speak. The water of the Yi River flowed on, indifferent to the rise and fall of dynasties, but the Buddha remained, unblinking, watching the water pass. Wu Zetian turned from the statue, her heavy ceremonial robes trailing over the stone platform. She had secured the spiritual realm and subdued the mortal one. Now, she felt the urge to reshape the very language the empire spoke, to leave a mark not just on the land, but on the mind itself. The sun was setting, casting the great shadow of the Buddha across the valley floor, stretching toward the capital, where a new challenge waited. The challenge of defining her legacy in words that had never existed before. The scribes were waiting, and the ink was wet once more. The brush descended, dark and heavy with ink, meeting the pristine white of the paper, not with a scratch, but with a caress that carried the weight of an empire. In the quiet solitude of her study, surrounded by the scent of sandalwood and old parchment, Wu Zetian was not merely governing, she was creating. The scribes watched in hushed reverence as her hand moved with the fluid grace of a dancer and the precision of an executioner. She was designing a new language, a script that would force the world to see through her eyes. She drew a circle, suspended high the sun. Beneath it, a crescent hooked the moon, and below them both, the empty, expansive radical for the sky. The character was Zijiao. It was her chosen name, a name that did not exist until she willed it into being. It signified that she was the light of the sun and the moon shining together over the void of the universe, an illumination that touched every corner of the realm. By forcing the bureaucracy to learn and use these new characters, she was rewriting the cognitive map of the empire. Every time a minister wrote her name or the word for subject or life, they were forced to use her symbols, bending their minds to her logic, acknowledging that the old ways of the ancestors were obsolete. The Tang script was the language of men who had ruled before. The Zetian script was the language of the living goddess who ruled now. But while she captured the minds of the scholars with ink, she secured the obedience of the aristocracy with iron. The silence that filled the palace corridors in those years was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating quiet of holding one's breath. The air in the capital of Luoyang had grown thick with paranoia. Wu knew that the old clans, the powerful families of the northwest, who had supported the Tang founders, viewed her as an anomaly, a temporary usurper who would eventually be swept aside by the return of proper patriarchal order. She could not allow them the luxury of patience. To dismantle the old guard, she turned to men who existed outside the traditional power structures, men whose loyalty was bought with the promise of elevation from the dirt. Foremost among them was Lai Junchen, a man with a smile devoid of warmth and a mind like a steel trap. Under Wu's tacit approval, he constructed a network of shadows that stretched from the tea rooms of the merchants to the private chambers of the princes. In the public square of the capital, a brass urn was erected. It was an elegant, terrifying object, cast with 4 slots facing the 4 cardinal directions. It was designed to accept indictments. Anyone, a disgruntled servant, a jealous neighbor, a disgraced soldier, could slip a scroll into the copper mouth of the box, anonymously accusing another of treason. The box did not discriminate between truth and fabrication. It only consumed. Once a name was fed to the urn, the machinery of Lai Yunchen's investigation began. The reign of terror that followed was a surgical purging of the Tang elite. It was a time when the high officials went to morning court not knowing if they would return to their families by evening. The interrogation rooms were dark, filled with the smoke of braziers and the terrifying creativity of the torturers, yet the purpose was not merely cruelty. It was a systematic uprooting of the glorious old oaks that blocked the sunlight from Wu's new garden. The Li imperial clan, the cousins and brothers of the deceased Emperor Taizong, found themselves ensnared in webs of conspiracy, real or imagined. One by one, the princes who might have rallied an army against the Empress Dowager were removed, their lineages broken, their titles dissolved into dust. Wu observed this from behind her pearl curtain, her face impassive. She understood the cost. She knew the historians would dip their brushes in vitriol to describe these years, but she also knew that a woman sitting on the dragon throne could not afford the luxury of mercy. Mercy was for those who were safe. Ruthlessness was the armor of the pioneer. She was clearing the ground, burning the weeds so that something unprecedented could grow. By the year 690, the soil was scorched and ready. Wu Zetian was 65 years old, in an age when most retreated to the care of their grandchildren or the solitude of the monastery. She was preparing for her greatest metamorphosis, the regency. The title of Empress Dowager, the role of the two sages, these were all cloaks she had worn to conceal her true form. They were temporary measures. The time had come to discard the veil entirely. The movement began not with a decree from above, but with a swell from below, a carefully orchestrated tide of popular will. It started with a petition. A low-ranking official, sensing the shift in the wind, submitted a request that she take the throne not as a regent, but as the emperor in her own right. Then came the deluge. Thousands of petitions flooded the capital. Commoners, monks, merchants, and terrifyingly, the very officials who had survived the purges gathered at the palace gates. They brought with them omens, a stone discovered in the river bearing a prophecy, a phoenix seen rising from the mist of the southern mountains, the sudden blooming of flowers out of season. The city of Luoyang became a theatre of divine mandate. 60,000 people gathered, a sea of silk and hemp, chanting for the mother to ascend. They claimed that the Tang dynasty had exhausted its mandate of heaven, that its energy was spent, and that the universe demanded a new vessel. Wu declined the first petition, a ritualistic display of humility. She declined the second, showing her virtue. But when the third wave crashed against the steps of the imperial hall, she allowed herself to accept the burden of destiny. The day of the coronation was unlike any the empire had ever witnessed. The banners that snapped in the autumn wind were not the color of the Tang, but a deep, resonant gold and crimson, colors she had chosen for her new dynasty. She ascended the high platform of the imperial altar, her heavy robes embroidered with the 12 imperial symbols: the sun, the moon, the stars, the mountain, the dragon, and the pheasant insignia that had been forbidden to women since the dawn of time. As she climbed the steps, the weight of the pearl headdress pressed down on her brow, a physical reminder of the crushing pressure of her ambition. She did not look back at the spectres of the past, the strangled princes, the banished rivals, the ghost of the gentle Emperor Gaozong. She looked only forward, toward the smoke of the incense rising in thick, fragrant pillars to the heavens. When she turned to face the multitude, the silence was absolute. Then the drums beat a rhythmic, thundering pulse that vibrated in the chest of every soul present. The proclamation was read, the voice of the herald booming across the courtyards. The Tang dynasty was declared interrupted, placed into a state of dormancy. In its place rose the Zhou dynasty, named after the ancient, idealized kingdom of antiquity, evoking a return to perfect virtue and sage rule. Wu Zetian was no longer a concubine, no longer a wife, no longer a mother of emperors. She was the Shenzhen Huangdi, the holy and divine emperor. She stood at the pinnacle of the world, the only woman in 3,000 years of history to hold the supreme title in her own name. The glass ceiling of the Confucian cosmos had not just been cracked, it had been shattered, ground into dust, and scattered to the winds. Yet, as the cries of 10,000 years washed over her, a wave of adulation that shook the very foundations of the city, There was a solitude in her eyes that the distance concealed. To be a god on earth is to be utterly alone. The air at the summit was thin and cold. She had achieved the impossible. She had rewritten the laws of nature, but the victory was a solitary monolith. She sat upon the dragon throne, her hands resting on the carved armrests, feeling the cool, polished wood. The court lay prostrate before her, a landscape of bowed backs and hushed reverence. She was the materia come to earth, the sage ruler, the architect of a golden age. But the wheel of time continued to turn, indifferent to her triumph. She had conquered the court, the aristocracy, and the gender hierarchy, but the final enemy, mortality itself, was waiting in the shadows, patient and undefeated. The golden age of the Zhou had begun. Wu threw herself into the governance of her empire with a vigor that belied her age. She reformed the civil service exams further, making them anonymous to prevent bias, ensuring that men of talent from the poorest villages could rise to become chancellors if their minds were sharp enough. She patronized the arts, commissioned vast encyclopedias, and kept the borders secure. But the palace, for all its splendor, began to feel like a gilded cage, and as the years of her reign stretched on, the shadows that she had banished to the corners of the room began to lengthen once more, taking new shapes, whispering new threats. The heart of the emperor remained a fortress, but even fortresses suffer the erosion of the wind. In the quiet of the night, long after the ministers had departed and the candles had burned low, Wu would sometimes sit by the window, looking up at the moon, the very moon she had captured in her character, Zhao. She wondered if the celestial body recognized its earthly counterpart. The dominance she exerted was absolute, yet the human connections that tethered her to the world were fraying. The children she had exiled, the family she had purged, the lovers she had taken, they were all pieces in a game she had won, but the board was growing empty. The final coup had been struck, the throne was hers. But the story was not simply about seizing power, it was about the terrible, enduring effort of holding it. As the seasons turned, bringing the biting winds of winter to the capital, a new kind of unrest began to stir, not among the people, but within the inner chambers of her own private life, where the political and the personal would collide in a final tragic unraveling. That unrest was a quiet thing at first, distinct from the clamour of the court or the rhythmic marching of the imperial guard. It was the unrest of time itself, the one adversary that no iron whip or secret police could intimidate. Yet, even as the years etched lines of wisdom and weariness onto her face, the broad, square forehead that the physiognomists had once praised as the mark of a dragon Wu Zetian did not retreat. She simply evolved, transforming from the power behind the curtain into the very sun that illuminated the empire. For decades, during the era the court whispered of as the reign of the two sages, she had sat behind a screen of shimmering pearl and silk, her voice mingling with that of the ailing emperor Gaosong until the ministers could no longer distinguish husband from wife, emperor from empress. But when the screen was finally removed, and she ascended the steps to claim the title of Huangdi, for herself the first and only woman to do so, she revealed a vision of governance that was as nurturing as it was severe. She understood that a dynasty built solely on blood was fragile, so she rooted hers in the earth. Her mind, honed by the history books of her youth, turned toward the vast ochre fields of the peasantry. She issued the 12 Suggestions, a decree that rippled out from the capital to the furthest provinces. It was a manifesto of pragmatism that commanded the reduction of taxes and the encouragement of sericulture and agriculture. She knew that the stability of the throne rested on the fullness of the granaries and the contentment of the villages. Under her watch, the rigid social hierarchies began to dissolve. She bypassed the entrenched northwestern aristocracy, the old families who looked down upon her merchant origins, and opened the massive doors of the bureaucracy to men of talent, regardless of their birth. Through the civil service examinations, she cultivated a new crop of scholars, the North Gate scholars, who owed their rise not to their ancestors, but to her patronage. They became her brush and her shield, drafting the edicts that reshaped the empire. She even dared to rewrite the laws of grief. In a profound act of reshaping culture, she decreed that the mourning period for a mother should equal that of a father 3 long years. It was a subtle, seismic shift, a declaration that the womb that bore life was equal to the seed that sparked it, elevating the status of women in a way that no sword could achieve. To solidify this new reality, she sought to reshape the heavens as well. If the Confucian texts offered no place for a female ruler, she would find her legitimacy in the sutras of Buddhism. She turned her eyes to the limestone cliffs of Longmen, where the Yi River carved through the landscape. There, amidst the dust of chisels and the chanting of monks, she commissioned a work of art that would outlast the timber of her palaces. The great Vairocana Buddha rose from the rock, a colossus of stone sitting in eternal serenity. It is said that the sculptors, working under imperial decree, modelled the face of the Buddha after Wu herself. The statue's eyes, heavy-lidded and compassionate, gazed down upon the river, possessing a plump, majestic beauty that defied the delicate frailty expected of court women. It was a face of strength, a face of the divine sovereign, watching over her realm with a gaze that bridged the mortal and the infinite. She took the brush into her own hand, inventing new characters to cleanse the language of the past. She crafted the character Zhaol for her own name, placing the sun and the moon side by side above the sky. It was a symbol of total illumination, a proclamation that her radiance encompassed both the masculine and the feminine, the day and the night. She was not merely a ruler, she was a phenomenon of nature, but the light she cast created deep, impenetrable shadows. To maintain this imperial radiance, she walked a path paved with fear. The secret police, led by the infamous Lai Yinshan, became the spectres of the capital. The informer's box stood ready to receive whispered accusations, a device that turned neighbors into spies and silence into a survival strategy. The old guard was systematically pruned, their lineages cut short to ensure no rival could challenge the new sun. It was a reign of terror, yes, but to Wu, it was the necessary weeding of a garden she intended to leave in perfect order. Yet, the seasons of a human life are immutable. The sun must eventually set. As Wu entered her 80s, the inevitable twilight descended. The court, once paralyzed by her brilliance, began to shift. The Northgate scholars grew old, and new voices, yearning for the restoration of the House of Li, began to murmur in the corridors. The end did not come with the clash of armies or the burning of cities. It came with the quiet shuffle of boots in the hallway, a palace coup that was more of a forced retirement than a violent overthrow. In the year 705, heavy with age and illness, the woman who had mastered wild horses and tamed an empire was moved to a secondary palace. She was forced to abdicate, passing the throne back to her son, returning the dynasty to the Tang lineage. In those final months, stripped of her celestial titles, she was once again simply a mother and a widow. The fire of ambition that had burned for half a century cooled into the grey ash of reflection. She issued one final edict, not of command, but of submission to the order of things. She asked to be buried, not as an emperor but as an empress, to rest beside her husband Gaozong in the Qunling mausoleum. She chose to close the circle, returning to the side of the man who had first brought her from the convent back to the world. The procession that carried her to the mausoleum was grand, winding its way to the site located on Mount Liang, northwest of the capital. The path was lined with stone statues, ostriches, winged horses, and guardian officials standing as silent sentinels for the woman who had ruled them all. At the entrance of the tomb, 2 towering stels were erected. On the west side stood a tablet dedicated to Emperor Gaozong, its surface crowded with golden inscriptions praising his military victories and administrative wisdom. On the east side stood the tablet for Wu Zetian. It was a massive block of stone, rising tall and imposing against the sky. But when the masons approached her with their chisels, asking what words should be carved to immortalize her deeds, the answer was silence. The stele was left blank. It remains there to this day, known as the wordless stele. Some say she left it blank because she believed her achievements were too vast for mere words to contain. Others whisper that she knew her sins were too heavy to be recorded, and she dared not write them down. But perhaps, in that final, quiet wisdom, she understood that history is a fluid thing, rewritten by every generation that follows. She would not dictate how she was to be remembered. She would leave the stone empty, allowing the wind, the rain, and the passing centuries to write their own judgment upon her memory. She had been a concubine, a nun, a mother, a killer, a bodhisattva, and a god. She had been the sun and the moon. And in the end, she became the silence of the mountain itself. The wind now blows over the plains of Shangs, whistling past the stone guardians and brushing against the rough, unpolished surface of the wordless dale. The empire she built has turned to dust and risen again a dozen times. The wooden palaces have rotted and the silk scrolls have faded. But the stone remains. It stands under the same moon that she once watched from her window, a silent testament to a life that defied the boundaries of the world. The story is finished. The scroll is rolled shut and the ink is dry. The noise of the dynasty fades into the rhythm of the night, leaving only the peace of the earth and the heavy, comforting blanket of sleep. Good night.